In the long and often divisive history of American immigration reform, few figures have remained as central or as persistent as Senator Lindsey Graham. Representing South Carolina, Graham has been a vocal presence in the United States Senate, consistently pushing for legislation that seeks to address what many consider a broken immigration system. While there is no single piece of legislation officially titled the Graham Bill, the phrase has come to represent a series of legislative efforts either led or strongly supported by Graham, particularly those dealing with the legal status of undocumented immigrants, border enforcement, and the broader restructuring of U.S. immigration policy. One of the most prominent examples of Graham's involvement in immigration reform came in 2018, when he partnered with Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois, to introduce a bipartisan bill in response to the Trump administration's decision to rescind the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. This program, initially created during the Obama administration, offered temporary protection from deportation and work authorization to young people brought to the United States illegally as children. Commonly referred to as dreamers, these individuals grew up in America, often spoke only English, and had little to no connection to their countries of birth. When the Trump administration moved to end DACA, nearly 800,000 people were at risk of losing their legal protections. The Graham-Durbin bill aimed to provide a legislative solution. This proposal sought to provide dreamers with a pathway to citizenship, but it came at a cost that reflected the political realities of the time. In exchange for protections for dreamers, the bill allocated over $2.5 billion for border security, including funding for physical barriers along the U.S.-Mexico border. It also made significant changes to the legal immigration system by eliminating the diversity visa lottery and curtailing certain family-based immigration categories. To many, this was a painful compromise. Supporters saw it as a realistic, if imperfect, solution to a long-standing issue. Critics on both sides of the aisle, however, saw the trade-offs as either too extreme or too lenient. Conservative lawmakers labeled the pathway to citizenship as amnesty, while progressive lawmakers and immigration advocates argued that the bill compromised too much on immigrant rights and caved in to hardline border policies. Despite being introduced with considerable attention and hopes for bipartisanship, the Graham-Durbin bill failed to pass. It was a clear demonstration of the deep partisan divides that dominate immigration policy in Washington. Though many Americans expressed support for dreamers, and polling suggested that a legislative solution had broad public backing, the political cost of compromise proved too high in the Senate. Still, the bill's introduction marked a continuation of Graham's long-held belief that immigration reform should be addressed seriously and compassionately, not simply used as a talking point in elections. This was not the first time Senator Graham had attempted to bridge the immigration divide. More than a decade earlier, in 2007, he was involved in another ambitious bipartisan effort to overhaul the immigration system. That initiative, often referred to as the McCain-Kennedy-Graham bill due to its co-sponsors, attempted to tackle illegal immigration, create a legal guest worker program, and provide a path to legal status for millions of undocumented immigrants already residing in the United States. Like the 2018 proposal, it also included provisions for increased border enforcement and visa reforms. The idea was to build a system that balanced economic needs, humanitarian considerations, and the enforcement of immigration laws. However, the 2007 bill was met with fierce opposition, especially from conservative activists who rallied against what they described as amnesty. Town halls filled with angry constituents, talk radio hosts denounced the proposal, and pressure mounted on lawmakers to abandon the deal. Despite the efforts of Graham and his colleagues, the bill never made it through the Senate. The failure was not only a blow to Graham's immigration agenda, but also a turning point in the Republican Party's approach to the issue. For many Republicans, opposition to comprehensive immigration reform became a litmus test for political loyalty. Over time, Graham's positions placed him in a complex and often precarious position within his own party. While he supported increased border enforcement and strong national security policies, he also remained one of the few Republicans willing to advocate publicly for a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. This stance earned him praise from immigrant rights groups and criticism from anti-immigration activists. To Graham, however, the solution was always about balance. He argued that the United States could not feasibly deport millions of undocumented people who had lived and worked in the country for years. At the same time, he maintained that any reform effort must begin with restoring the integrity of the border and enforcing immigration laws more consistently. Beyond immigration, Graham's legislative work also extended into national security, judicial reform, and military policy. Particularly after the September 11th attacks, Graham emerged as a key voice in crafting legal frameworks for the detention and prosecution of terrorism suspects. He supported the use of military tribunals for detainees held at Guantanamo Bay and introduced amendments to limit the ability of detainees to access federal courts. These moves sparked debates about the balance between civil liberties and national security, but they further illustrated Graham's willingness to take politically difficult stances on issues he believed were critical to protecting the country. Through all of this, what remained consistent in Graham's approach was a focus on institutional process and pragmatic negotiation. Unlike some lawmakers who chose ideological purity over legislative progress, Graham often worked across the aisle, earning both allies and enemies in the process. His involvement in immigration bills, particularly those referred to as Graham bills, showed a lawmaker attempting to find a middle ground in an increasingly polarized environment. While these efforts rarely ended in legislative victory, they reflected a desire to address complex issues through dialogue and compromise rather than political theater. Despite the repeated failures of immigration reform efforts associated with Graham, the core ideas behind his bills have influenced the national debate. They introduced concepts and policy frameworks that have been revisited, revised, and reintroduced in subsequent years by lawmakers from both parties. The Graham bills did not pass into law, but they contributed to the ongoing conversation about what a fair, effective, and humane immigration system might look like in the United States. In that sense, their legacy is not one of defeat, but of persistence in the face of political adversity. In the years following the failure of the 2018 Graham-Durbin bill, the political climate surrounding immigration grew even more contentious. With national elections looming and debates over border policy dominating headlines, the issue became less about policy details and more about symbolism. The border wall, once a line item in a budget negotiation, transformed into a political litmus test. In this environment, the type of bipartisan legislation Senator Graham advocated for became increasingly difficult to imagine, let alone pass. Still, Graham remained vocal, occasionally suggesting updated versions of his earlier proposals, even if they had little chance of advancing through the sharply divided Senate. While his immigration proposals struggled to gain momentum, Graham's broader influence in the Senate continued to grow. He became chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a role that placed him at the center of some of the most significant legal and constitutional debates of the era. He played a prominent role in the confirmation hearings of Supreme Court nominees, most notably during the tumultuous process to confirm Justice Brett Kavanaugh. His performance during those hearings marked a shift in his public persona, from a centrist deal-maker to a fiery partisan defender, especially of conservative judicial nominees. This evolution caused many to question whether Graham's days of reaching across the aisle were over, or whether his bipartisan instincts still held sway in private negotiations. Nonetheless, on immigration, he continued to assert that the system was in crisis. He often pointed to the growing number of asylum seekers at the southern border, the overwhelming of immigration courts, and the exploitation of legal loopholes by human traffickers and smugglers. In 2019, he introduced another bill aimed at reforming asylum procedures and detaining families together while their claims were processed. This bill, while distinct from the earlier Dreamer-focused legislation, continued his pattern of mixing enforcement with targeted reforms. Critics argued that it prioritized detention and enforcement over humanitarian protection, while supporters insisted it addressed loopholes that incentivized illegal border crossings. Throughout these years, Graham's shifting political tone reflected the broader changes within the Republican Party. Once known for working closely with figures like John McCain and Joe Lieberman, Graham increasingly aligned himself with President Donald Trump, whom he had once sharply criticized during the 2016 campaign. This alignment brought him closer to the conservative base but distanced him from some of his former allies in the Senate. Despite this shift, he continued to argue that a lasting solution to America's immigration problems would require bipartisan cooperation, something he insisted he still believed was possible, even if politically costly. As the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded in 2020, immigration issues were momentarily eclipsed by public health emergencies, economic instability, and a contentious presidential election. Travel restrictions, public fears, and executive orders dominated the national conversation, and comprehensive immigration reform once again faded into the background. However, the underlying problems remained unresolved. The expiration of temporary protections, backlogged immigration courts, and inconsistent enforcement policies created a patchwork system that many, including Graham, described as unworkable. When President Joe Biden took office in 2021, immigration returned to the forefront of the political agenda. The new administration proposed sweeping changes, including a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, expanded refugee admissions, and the rollback of several Trump-era restrictions. Once again, Lindsey Graham found himself in a familiar position, criticizing certain aspects of Democratic proposals while signaling openness to negotiate. In interviews and public statements, he continued to argue that reform could only happen if both sides made difficult concessions. Democrats would need to accept stronger enforcement, and Republicans would need to accept some form of legal status for those already living and working in the country. Despite periodic discussions and the introduction of various proposals, no comprehensive bill materialized. The political cost remained too high and trust between the parties too low. Graham's efforts, though not always visible, persisted behind closed doors. He occasionally met with colleagues from both parties, floated smaller reform packages, and tried to revive interest in compromise bills. However, the reality of modern American politics, where legislative victories are often less important than ideological purity, left little room for the kind of incremental, negotiated solutions he had long championed. The story of the Graham bill, then, is not the story of a single piece of legislation, but rather the story of a series of attempts to solve a problem that the federal government has long struggled to address. It represents years of legislative labor, political risk, and persistent outreach across the aisle. It reflects the deep frustrations and real-world consequences of congressional gridlock. Most importantly, it tells the story of a legislator who, despite changing political winds and shifting alliances, continued to return to the negotiating table in hopes of finding a workable answer to one of the most complex policy challenges of the modern era. Even those who disagree with Graham's politics often acknowledge that his efforts stem from a genuine desire to solve a problem rather than merely exploit it. He has repeatedly emphasized that fixing immigration is not only a moral imperative, but also an economic necessity and a national security issue. Businesses, especially in agriculture and hospitality, rely heavily on immigrant labor. Communities across the country, from rural farms to urban tech centers, depend on immigrants to thrive, and national security experts consistently point to the need for an orderly, transparent, and fair immigration system to prevent abuse and ensure accountability. While critics have sometimes accused Graham of inconsistency or opportunism, pointing to his evolving stance during the Trump years, Others argue that his shifting tone reflects a political reality that many lawmakers face: the need to survive politically while trying to govern responsibly. His continued willingness to talk about immigration, even when it became politically toxic, set him apart from many of his peers who chose silence or posturing over engagement. He has often said that immigration reform will require leadership, courage, and a willingness to be disliked, qualities he has tried, not always successfully, to embody. As of 2025, the Graham Bill lives on more as a symbol than as a statute. It stands as a reminder of what bipartisan cooperation can attempt, even when it ultimately falls short. In the pages of Senate history, the proposals associated with Lindsey Graham are likely to be revisited, repackaged, and perhaps one day enacted in some new form. The debates he helped shape will continue to inform policy discussions, and the framework he proposed, balancing border security with legal protections, remains central to most serious immigration reform proposals. Whether he is remembered as a pioneer of compromise or a politician caught between two eras will depend on how future lawmakers choose to build on his work. In a political culture often defined by spectacle, Lindsey Graham's legislative efforts stand as examples of the less glamorous side of governance, the work of negotiation, drafting, failing, revising, and trying again. The Graham Bill may not be law, but it is, in many ways, a reflection of what lawmaking actually looks like: messy, incremental, imperfect, and always incomplete. Yet in its imperfection lies its significance. It reminds us that complex problems rarely have simple solutions, and that sometimes progress means returning to the same table over and over again, even when no one is watching.